The next step that we have in the cardiovascular unit is the heart, and they they double dip a little bit, kind of explain some stuff again. That's okay. Just reinforces what we talked about the other day. When we talk about the cardiovascular system, specifically today, we're talking about the heart, but I mean, the cardiovascular system is the heart, is the blood vessels, and quite honestly, it also includes the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system has no pumper. The lymphatic system uses basically the force exerted by the heart. So the lymphatic system gets dumped into this unit as well because of that fact. Some functions, yeah. I mean, nothing really outstandingly difficult here. Transport blood throughout the body. I mean, that's what we do. And that's really what the heart does. The heart is what helps to push this blood all throughout the body. And it makes sure that everything has the proper amount of blood that it needs. That's the next most really important thing that it does. Provides adequate perfusion. And that's just the delivery of blood. Okay. How much? It depends on local settings at the time. And by local settings, I mean local conditions. Are we exercising? Are we not exercising? Are we getting up? Are we sitting down? Are we laying down? Do we go from a laying to a seated? Are we going from a laying to a standing position? All of that affects how much blood gets delivered. All of that affects how fast, how hard the heart is going to contract. And there are a number of receptors that help to maintain the heart's ability to pump the proper amount to the various different regions of the body. And we'll hint at some of that over this and next lecture. Again, arteries, veins, capillaries, blah, 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 blah. We talked about this the other day. Arteries, they always carry blood away from the heart. Okay. Again, I say this, I said this in the last one, I'm going to say it in this one. It is one of the most common concepts screwed up, and it is honestly, the easiest concept. Arteries take blood away from the heart. We are going to see today pulmonary arteries. They take blood to the lungs. These pulmonary arteries take blood away from the heart to the lungs. These pulmonary arteries carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. They come back in pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins come back from the lungs, back to the heart, carrying oxygenated rich blood. Everywhere else in the body, femoral artery, femoral vein. Femoral arteries carry oxygenated blood now. Femoral vein carries deoxygenated blood primarily now. So whether or not it's oxygenated or non-oxygenated depends on really which system. Are we talking about the systemic system or the pulmonary system? And a number of people always screw it up, even though I sit here and lament that this is the easiest concept, but for whatever reason, people just get going too fast on an exam, whether it be lecture or whether it be lab, and they screw up these very simplistic ideas. So go slow. Take a deep breath. Go slow. Capillaries, this is where all the magic's going to happen in terms of gas exchange, nutrients exchange. We mentioned that the other day. We'll see a little bit of that today, but we're going to talk about that more in the next lecture, or in the next chapter, I guess I should say. We'll see how much we get done today. So here is the heart. We have two sides. We have the right side of the heart, and we have the left side of the heart. They look similar, but they do have some subtle differences between them, and they do vastly different things because of those subtle differences. The right side, it always receives deoxygenated blood, okay? It always receives deoxygenated blood. This is coming back from the superior aspect of the body and the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava. from the inferior aspect of the body via the inferior vena cava, above the heart and below the heart, and the coronary sinus. These are the three vessels that dump deoxygenated blood into that first chamber, the right atrium. We pump that deoxygenated blood from the right atrium down into the bottom chamber, the right ventricle. And then the right ventricle is the pumper. It pumps the blood towards the lungs. The left side receives oxygenated blood. Okay, it receives it. Where does it get it from? Our pulmonary veins. Pushes it from the atria down into that left ventricle, and that left ventricle pumps it to the entire body. Pumps blood away. Of the 4 different chambers that exist here, the 2 on the bottom are going to be the ones that we probably look at a heck of a lot more, but the 2 top ones are just as important, okay? The top ones are just as important. If they receive too much blood, well, we got issues. If they receive too little blood, well, we got some issues, okay? And we'll talk about that probably in the next lecture because that's at the very end. We have a number of vessels that will connect into this heart, as you can see from the picture there. We have the pulmonary trunk, and that's what's taking blood to the lungs. Okay. There's the pulmonary trunk right here. And we have left and right pulmonary arteries. Internet's being tricky today. We have the aorta. These are our 2 major trunks. Okay, there's the aorta and all of its majesticness right there. The aorta receives blood from the left ventricle, and the aorta is basically sending this throughout the different parts of the regions of the body. Okay. We have, we have a vessel going this way. We have a vessel going up to the brain, and we're going to have a vessel going out to that arm. Okay. So that aorta is going to be really big, accepts a big volume of blood. And it's going to distribute it to a multitude of various different regions. We have, as I mentioned earlier, the superior vena cava, bringing deoxygenated rich blood to that right side, that right atrium. And from below the heart, the inferior vena cava, doing it there. Right there. And right there are my pulmonary veins, bringing oxygenated rich blood to that left atrium. Aside from arteries and veins, what they do, blood way, blood towards. Another thing that people flip-flop is calling the right the left and the left the right. Okay. This is the left side, even though you think it may be the right. It's to the person laying on the table. Okay. Left side, right side. Something else that's flip-flopped by a handful of people, not by everybody, but a couple people always screw that up. Some other pieces of important anatomy are valves. Valves are one of the most important concepts that we have here when it comes to the heart. Blood vessels, lymphatic vessels. Valves ensure that blood goes forward in one direction. If we didn't have these valves, whenever the heart relaxed or gravity pulled on it, it would cause the blood to go backwards through the system. And obviously that would not be a very effective mechanism for getting blood to go forward through a system. So valves are there to ensure that this blood does flow forward through the system, doesn't back up. Because if it backs up, it's going to cause a whole host of problems, which we'll briefly kind of go through and mention. When it comes to the heart, there are two basic types of valves: the atrioventricular valves, or the AV valves, as you've probably heard them, and the semilunar valves. The atrioventricular valves, they sit in between the atria and the ventricles. And they're highlighted there for you in green, I believe. Yes, green. Okay. We have a right atrioventricular valve and a left atrioventricular valve. How genius. But they also have a buttload of other names, and you should be comfortable with them. I would accept, I guess, any of them on a lab exam if I was to ask. Right AV valve is also called the tricuspid valve. Bicuspid valve is the left AV valve, and that's just because of the number of cusp it has. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. The bicuspid valve also, the people who, doing the first dissections, thought it looked like a Middle Eastern headdress, I believe. And that's where mitral comes from. So tricuspid, bicuspid, left and right AV valves, those are kind of the most common names used on the exams. I'll accept any of them, though. Semilunar valves are, as the name implies, semilunar shaped. So they're kind of half moon shaped, and you can kind of see that right there. Okay. There it is. And there it is. Okay. We have two of those as well. We have a valve, a semilunar valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, and that is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And we have a semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, and that's the aortic semilunar valve. And these guys have a weird shape, and I think we'll discuss it a little bit later, how these guys all work, but they are semilunar shaped because, as you can kind of see here, we have to get up and over. We have to get up and over, okay? So invariably, not 100% of the blood is ever going to get up and over during a heart contraction. So whatever blood didn't get up and over that hump there will start to kind of come back towards the heart. Well, you can see they're kind of cusp shaped. So as that blood starts rolling back, it fills that cusp in, shuts it up. And therefore, blood does not go backwards into the various different chambers. So their shape kind of dictates their function here. It's a classic example of structure function. I made references to circuits here, and here they are. I mean, this is not earth-shattering. The pulmonary circuit, pulmonary means lungs. Okay. So, this is basically the right ventricle, the pulmonary trunk, the left and right pulmonary arteries, left and right there, and then in the lungs, and then really it stops. The left and right pulmonary veins, the left atrium, left ventricle, aorta. I mean, that's pretty much the systemic circuit. The only difference is, well, there's a number of differences. But really the major difference is what are they transporting, right? The pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary circulation is dealing with deoxygenated blood first, taking it to the lungs to pick it up. The systemic circulation is involving the picked up oxygen and then distributing that throughout the body. All right. Whenever you're first learning this stuff and going over this stuff after you take the exam this weekend, I always go over the heart in terms of bringing it back. Okay. So I always start with deoxygenated blood first. So I always talk about, the various different veins, superior and inferior vena cavas, coronary sinus dumping blood into the, excuse me, right atrium. Goes to the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, into left and right pulmonary arteries. Go to the lungs, pick up the O2, come back in the left and right pulmonary veins, dump it into the left atrium, through the bicuspid, because you have to try something before you buy it. Go through the bicuspid valve, into that left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve, into the ascending aorta, arch of the aorta, and then wherever we're going to go. Okay. Wherever we're going to go. And as I sit here and think about it, the next lecture looks at blood vessels. There's a ton of slides there in that lecture. We're not necessarily going to go over every single one of them, because to be honest, some of it's there for you to look at when you are reviewing for lab. Okay. We'll go over a couple of them, but we're not going to go over every single one of them. Flow charts. I believe the book has some flow charts associated with blood vessels. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we go over blood vessels, but just to give you a heads up, following a drop of blood from one location through the heart to another location, wouldn't that be a fabulous follow the path type of question for an exam? You know it. This leads us into a nice little clinical pearl. Anytime the heart fails to pump effectively, that is heart failure, right? When it's heart failure or congestive heart failure, we are talking about specifically the inability to pump blood. Who are the pumpers? The ventricles are the pumpers. If you know the pathway of blood through the heart, deoxygenated to oxygenated, figuring out the differences between these two is fairly easy. When it comes to congestive heart failure, you can have failure of the left or the right side of the heart, and specifically those ventricles. If you have pulmonary edema, pulmonary means lungs. Every time you see pulmonary, you should think lungs. Pulmonary edema is swelling. This is a fluid accumulation that occurs within the lungs. Pulmonary edema is a symptom of left ventricle failure. So let's think about this. If the ventricle is failing to eject all that blood, it's still filled up. Well, the body's still delivering. I have 100 units of blood to transport. I don't care if you're only getting out 20 units. I'm bringing 100, so figure it out. And what happens to that blood? It's going to back up, right? So it backs up from the left ventricle into the left atrium. Backs up through those pulmonary veins and ultimately in the lungs. Makes it very difficult to breathe because now there's more fluid within the lungs, and the lungs don't really function outside of your first few months of life inside mom as you're forming. They're not really designed for that. So it really makes it difficult to breathe and to effectively get gas exchange to occur. Tired, lethargic, some of the side effects of having pulmonary edema, right? Systemic edema, this is, ascites. This is swelling within the abdomen. This is swelling within the body. Systemic edema. Systemic edema is the exact opposite. The ventricle that's failed now is the right ventricle. Right ventricle, not pumping effectively, backs up into the right atrium, into the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, coronary sinus, yada, yada, yada. But where's this backing up to? The rest of the body. The arms, the brain, the stomach, the abdomen, the lower appendages. And that's where you're going to see the vast amount of fluid accumulation is down in the abdomen, and that's called ascites. So this congestive heart failure, I don't know if I necessarily ask a specific question about it. I don't know, maybe I would, I don't know. But I could ask about, congestive heart failure resulting in fluid accumulation within the lungs. Who's impaired and what's the major symptom you're going to see? And difficulty breathing or fluid accumulation in the lungs would be your example of that. But this is more of, where's my thing? More of telling me which ventricle has failed and then understanding how fluid is moving through this thing or how it's supposed to, right? And obviously it's not functioning right. It's not going through the heart right. So you can go backwards and you could tell me why and how ascites or pulmonary accumulation of fluid is accumulating.